Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Mary Fournier Goldson Lecture for 2025. My name is Melissa Begg, and I have the great honor of serving as Dean of the Columbia School of Social Work. This lecture was established in 1991, and the Mary Fournier Goldson Lecture honors the vision and memory of its namesake, a member of the Columbia School of Social Work faculty and a tireless advocate on behalf of children and families. Mary Fournier Goldson was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1935. She received her BA from Bennett College in North Carolina, which I think is an HBCU, and then she got her MSW from Case Western Reserve University. In 1969, she joined CSSW as a faculty member, and she directed our programs in child welfare. She was a treasured teacher and colleague until her untimely passing in 1990. Now, before joining our group here as an assistant professor, she had many important roles. One was director of the Community Consultation Center for the Henry Street Settlement. She was responsible there for supervising the comprehensive community health program. She served on numerous boards and was a member of key child welfare organizations, including the Citizens Committee for Children of New York. Professor Goldson was also a consultant to the Lower East Side Family Union and Family and Children's Services agencies in many places, New York, New Jersey, Ohio, and Florida. Professor Goldson was a significant force in shaping integrated and comprehensive services for families and children. Her colleagues described her as a superior teacher who could light up a classroom with her ability to engage students. She was a dedicated professional, a remarkable person, and I'm very sorry that I never got to meet her myself, but I'm glad to be here and to continue to celebrate her legacy. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jane Waldfogel. Dr. Waldfogel is the Compton Foundation Centennial Professor for the Prevention of Children's and Youth Problems here at CSSW. She's also a visiting professor at the Center for the Analysis of Social Exclusion at London School of Economics. And there are many things I could say more about Dr. Waldfogel, but she has given me permission to shorten this. So I'm just going to focus on her latest book. It's just about to be released by Russell Sage, I think next month. It's called Child Benefits, A Smart Investment for America's Future. Here. It draws on research that establishes that child benefit, like the extension of the child tax credit here in the United States, would reduce poverty and hardship and lift a lot of children out of poverty in the United States and across the world. Dr. Waldfogel received her doctorate in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School. And Jane, we're delighted that you're here to introduce our wonderful speaker for today. Thank you.
Thank you for that nice introduction, Melissa. So it's great that you've invited me to talk about my new book. I'm really excited. Oh, no, wait. No. You've invited me to introduce Lonnie, which is really a pleasure. So Lonnie's a social worker. He got his MSW at Hunter, and he got his PhD here at Columbia. He's on the faculty at University of Wisconsin at Madison, and I have to read his multiple titles. Lonnie's the only person I know who occupies 2 endowed chairs at the same time. So he is a busy person. He is he's for a while now been the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor in the School of Social Work at Madison, but he's more recently become the Sheila B. Kammerman and Alfred J. Kahn Professor of Social Policy. So named after 2 of our distinguished faculty, and that was Lonnie's choice. He was given a choice as to how to name the chair, and he said, I'd like to honor Sheila and Al, which says a lot about him. In his spare time, he serves as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research in the Social Sciences at the University of Wisconsin. I don't know how he does that on top of all of his research. He told me to go light on the prior accomplishments, so I will only mention he used to be the director of the Institute for Research on Poverty. He's received the Society for Social Work Research Social Policy Researcher Award. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare. He's one of the top 15 global contributors to social work scholarship. Lonnie works on research on children and families involved with the child welfare system, the broader social welfare system. Throughout his career, he studied especially the economic well-being of children and families. He's unusual among these type of scholars in focusing not just on family income and wealth, but also paying attention to debt, which is what he's going to be talking about today. So please join me in welcoming Lonnie.
Thanks, Dave. Still a little long for my taste, but Thank you. I appreciate the kind introduction. And thank you, Dean Begg, for inviting me and all the terrific colleagues I've met with today. And Mimi and Jacqueline for all of your terrific help and attentiveness and getting all the logistics together. So it's really fantastic to be back here where I trained and where colleagues and scholars, both before my time, during my time, and after my time here, have been so influential in my work, and more importantly, in social work and social policy, really throughout the world. Um, it's really nice to kind of be giving this, or really an honor to give the Goldson Lecture, because she made these great contributions to both scholarship and real world practice in the child welfare arena, where I do a lot of my work. So I'm actually not going to talk about that work today. I'm going to talk about some newer work that I've been doing that is really focused on, I have a couple projects looking at both the causes and consequences of high cost debt. So basically unsecured debt, so debts that aren't attached to an asset, so a house, a car, et cetera, or human capital development, so student loans, and how this plays out across the income distribution. So I'm really going to talk today about sort of what's the role of social policy in potential debt accumulation among low-income populations, um, and do more generous policies prevent people from borrowing at high cost rates. So I'm going to do a couple things. So the first, I'm going to try to convince you that this is an important and understudied area for social work and for social policy. I'm second going to take you through a little bit of the landscape on what's been happening in trends in debt, with a focus on this high cost debt. And then I'll talk a little bit about some theory on the credit welfare state trade-off. So do people borrow when welfare benefits are lower, and use welfare benefits instead of borrowing when they're higher? And then I'm going to try to walk you through sort of 4 recent empirical studies I've done that shed light on this. And it's mostly going to be pretty big picture. Okay, so over the past really 50 years, the access to credit and debt have grown dramatically in the US. And I'm going to show you some data on that. It started largely with mortgage debt, with education loans, and with auto loans. More recently, we've seen big increases in this unsecured debt and this high cost debt, from credit cards to payday loans. And this is being driven by both supply and demand side factors. So on the supply side, we've really opened up credit markets, which in many ways is a good thing. So populations that were traditionally excluded from credit markets, populations of color, lower income, have more access to credit. We've deregulated those markets at the same time. And this has been the emergence of a whole bunch of new financial products. So think about the financial tech, the fintech industry, think about online borrowing. You can also think about storefront borrowing. And these span a whole range of different types. But what it means is people have more access to credit. People have been borrowing more. So that's the supply side. On the demand side, what we see is, over time, particularly in the lower end of the earnings distribution, relatively flat wages, and not as much wage growth, economic precarity. And so what you potentially see is more demand for loaning, and partly because cost of living has increased faster than wages, particularly in the lower, and particularly in the housing area. I'm going to try to argue today that what's kind of been left out of that story is potential changes in the social safety net over time, and how that may have contributed to folks' need to borrow. So I want to start by saying that access to credit is generally thought of as a benefit to people, right? So the ability to borrow can be extremely important. So you may need to borrow to weather an income shock, a layoff, a health shock, those kinds of things to sort of smooth your consumption until you get back on your feet. We borrow to invest in housing. We borrow to invest in human capital and education. And these are things that create future earnings or future wealth, and are really, likely to increase opportunities, to be associated with positive well-being, et cetera. On the flip side, people borrow for short-term consumption. They borrow in response to an economic shock or to meet basic needs when their incomes won't allow it. And that's okay if your income comes back up and you're able to repay it. And if you can repay it, along with the loan terms on time, not to get all kinds of extra fees and income and high interest rates, et cetera. Now, borrowing has at this point become a normative and common aspect of household finances. So the vast majority of households have some kind of debt. And these credit markets, though, remain very, very highly stratified. So what you essentially see is higher income people borrow at low cost. So they borrow for assets and for human capital development. It's relatively high or relatively low interest rates and fees. People borrowing often in response to an economic need are borrowing at high cost, so high interest and fees, and often borrowing to meet an immediate consumption need and not a long-term goal. So there are large literatures on the relationship of income and economic precarity with well-being, economic well-being, health, social and development of kids, sort of all areas you can think about. Smaller but relatively convincing body of research on wealth, and really suggests that more stable and higher economic resources are associated with better outcomes for children, for adults, for family functioning across most domains of well-being. Research, and some of it done by folks here at Columbia, has also really established that safety net policy generosity is important for poverty, is important for income, and through those links is important for social and economic well-being of kids and adults and the functioning of families. Very, very few studies have examined whether, and if so, how safety net policies may be linked to whether people take on debt and what kinds of debt they take on. And that's what I'm going to focus on most of today. So I got ahead of my slides a little bit, but I sort of said debt can be a resource and a liability. And so what I'll focus on here is that its relations with well-being can also be heterogeneous, right? So people borrow and households borrow for very different reasons, under very different circumstances, with very different loan terms, at very different amounts relative to their ability to repay. And all of these things are likely or may well influence their stress levels, their health levels, their parenting, and subsequent well-being and development. I also want to point out that increasingly over the last few decades, credit scores are used by landlords and by employers. And so credit, when you borrow and can't repay, your credit gets worse. So you get worse credit scores, which makes it harder to borrow at good rates in the future. You may have barriers to housing and employment. And so these pieces, and it results in a lot of stress. We've done some survey work in Wisconsin that I'll tell you about in a minute. People report very high levels of stress about paying back debt, about having money in collections. And so all of this may have negative consequences for repayment. So both not repaying and the stress to repay can be negative. So there's a small literature on the sort of distinct role of credit and debt and inequality therein with child and adult well-being. And so that's really teasing out debt itself, not the, what's your wealth minus debt, your total net worth. And essentially the story is housing debt either results in sort of no differences in adult and child well-being or positives, largely because better neighborhoods, better schools, these other kinds of things. Education debt is a very mixed story. It depends if you get a degree. It depends what the degree is worth. It depends on a whole lot of what your earnings are afterward. So a very mixed story. And I think that there is a sort of coming together of the literature on unsecured debt that largely, most of this literature is not causal, but largely it's negatively associated with well-being. So it's associated with more stress, more marital conflict, increases in divorce, increases in depression for adults. I've done some work on kids. It's associated with more behavioral problems and poorer socio-emotional development for kids. It's associated with child protective services involvement. So basically this bifurcating of these two markets where different types of debt may mean different things. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit about how trends in debt have changed in recent years. So this is looking at 2003 to 2024. What you see is a very steep incline in all kinds of debt until the Great Recession, right? It drops off, but it never comes anywhere near back down to where it was in 2003. And then right after the Great Recession starting, in 2012 or 13, it starts climbing again. So we are now at American households owe $18 trillion in household debt. This is 0.6 or 60% of all GDP. So lots of debt held by American households. Biggest, portion by far, housing debt, followed by education and auto debt. But you also see this growth in credit card debt so this is from credit reports, but they call other debt, which is actually excludes a huge amount of debts that low-income people have. So it doesn't have child support debt, medical debt, payday loans, auto title loans. None of that's even included in this. And that's true of most surveys as well. So I just want to point out, so it's not just mortgage debt. So this is the non-housing proportion of debt. And you see increases in pretty much all of these areas as well. If we think about it in terms of debt to income ratio, right? So it's not so bad if you can pay it back. So this is actually looking at 1950 to 2016. 2016 was the most recent I could find. Just massive increase in the debt to income ratio of American households. And I have it on the left broken out by the top 10%. So they, between 1950 and 2007, when it starts coming down, basically quadrupled their debt. The black line is the bottom 50%. The blue line is the 50 to 90% of the income distribution. The biggest explosion in sort of that middle pool. But the lower bottom 50% are pretty close to it. And they've, increased their debt by, almost 4 times over this period. It has started to fall a bit. So the second graph shows you the top 1% and the bottom 90%. It has started to come down a bit. And that's essentially partly the housing markets after the Great Recession. We pulled back on offering credit in a lot of areas a bit. And since that time, sort of income has kind of grown faster than people taking on debt in recent years. The last thing I want to show is that debt to income ratios vary really widely across states, and it's not necessarily the way I would expect it. So for instance, New York is a very low debt to income state. California is relatively high. You see Idaho and Utah are really high debt to income state. So this isn't just a story about cost of living, right? So it's about cost of living for sure, but it's about incomes. It's about debt regulation. So states have very different regulations around usury laws. So what interest and fees you can charge, what kinds of loans are legal, bankruptcy laws and debt discharge. They also have very different social policy generosity. And that's a lot of what I'm going to look at today. The other thing to think about is people's ability to repay debt. So this is in a bunch of debt areas. This is the 90-day delinquency rate. So people who are 90 days behind on their payments. And so what you see, so the bottom, the orange is mortgage, the green is auto loans, the purple is sort of home equity loans. So what you see, people are not defaulting a lot until we start edging up toward the Great Recession and the housing price. And then you see this big explosion in delinquency there. We also see delinquency on credit cards right around the same time, totally spike. And then we see, other also increasing. So most of these start coming down after, as the recession recedes. You don't see as much coming down as in the housing market around credit cards, and clearly don't see as much around student loans, that red line, until we hit COVID. And then we paused student loans, and then the Biden policies, keep them paused and try to forgive a bunch of loans. And what you see is it plummets. And so I want to make the point that policy matters, both in the debt world and potentially around labor markets and income. So how do people think about understanding debts and what constitutes debt burden? People often talk about good debt and bad debt. I'm not crazy about that framing, because particular kinds of debt may be good or bad depending on your circumstances and depending on the timing and what you're using it for. But I want to show you sort of two pieces of a framework. On the left, my colleague Rachel Dwyer has developed this framework for thinking about these quadrants of debt. So there are debts that are prospective that you choose to take on. You're going to borrow for housing, you're going to borrow for school, you're going to borrow on a credit card. And then there are these sort of retrospective debt obligations. And these are things that you didn't make a decision necessarily to take on, but you have to pay. So these are past due rent, these are past due bills, these are medical debt, these are past due utility payments, potentially child support debt, legal fines and fees, past due government payments and fees. And notably, with the exception of child support in surveys, none of these are really captured by our measures of debt in administrative data for the most part, and rarely in surveys. There are also, some of them are owed to the state and some of them are owed to the market, right? So you saw this left side, so FHA mortgages or federal student loans, these are prospective, they're owed to the state. On the right side, prime mortgages, private student loans, et cetera, are owed to the market. The same splitting that some of the retrospective are owed to each. And again, so even in the prospective credit offers, things like payday loans, pawn shop loans are not in the standard credit report data. Jason Houle and I have sort of come up with a way of thinking about debt instead of sort of good or bad, what we think of as agency, magnitude, and cost. So are you taking on this debt as a marker of privilege to borrow for an investment, to borrow for human capital, to weather a storm in a way that's secured by an asset that you can pay back? Or are you doing it out of need with very little ability to make a forward-looking choice about whether you need to borrow? And it's sort of a proactive versus reactive borrowing. The second thing we think about is magnitude. So how much are you borrowing in absolute terms and relative to your ability to repay that within the terms of the loan? Right? Do you have an asset that can guarantee it? If not, given the interest rates and fees, are you going to be able to pay it back within the terms? And the third piece we think about is the cost. So interest rates and fees, are you borrowing at 3% or 5%, or are you borrowing at 22%? And so we sort of think about the three of these combining to signal the extent to which that this debt is likely to be more of a resource or a burden. Okay. So because most or many of the debts that are most relevant to low income and lower middle income families aren't collected in most surveys, including Survey of Consumer Finances, colleagues and I put together a survey in Wisconsin. So this is of 600 middle and lower income families in Wisconsin, in the Milwaukee area. And we asked them this big battery of debt questions. We also did a random experiment within the survey of giving people the gold standard survey of consumer finances questions, compare how we're doing on debt with both of those. We also got their credit reports, compare what their credit reports are saying. The main point I want to make here is, so in the bottom, 82% of these families have some kind of debts. On average, they're holding 2.8 debts at a given time. They've had 3.8 types of debts over time. And most of these, so I have mortgages, I have credit cards, but most of these types of debt are not even collected or acknowledged in the work we do around debt. So some of them are small, 1 or 2%, tax refunds, employers, pawn shops, auto titles. And I will say, in the qualitative stuff we've done, people don't want to take auto title loans or payday loans. They know that they're predatory and subprime. They only do it when they are desperate. But all these other things, people owe for benefit overpayments, about 7% of our salary, or 6 or 7%. People owe, 27% owe for medical debt. People owe on buy now, pay later loans. So there is a lot going on in the lives of many of the clients that we serve around these different types of debt that we're often not aware of and often don't think about in social work and in social policy. So a little bit of a big picture on the theoretical framework of what's been called the credit welfare state trade-off. And essentially, it starts with that countries, governments have to make decisions about tensions between how to resolve tensions between, do we want to support lower income populations through market-based interventions, so in the labor market, in housing, in credit markets, versus social welfare solutions, social welfare challenges. And, from very broadly speaking, from in cross-national comparison, compared to the other wealthy countries, the US tends to be much more market-based. We tend to be much more means-tested as opposed to universal. We tend to be much more in kind as opposed to cash. And over time, we've become more and more work conditioned. The other piece to keep in mind about the US is that policy generosity varies substantially across states, and I'll show you some data on that in a minute, and that our credit markets and other markets are much more deregulated than in most of the other wealthy countries, which creates opportunities for very high cost subprime credit instruments. So the result is essentially that the US is characterized by unequal inclusion in segmented and stratified credit markets, right? Based on your SES, based on your location, et cetera. And also, sort of horizontal inequities in social safety net eligibility, participation, generosity, depending on where you live and what that state or sometimes locale does. So the social welfare policy generosity has the potential, so it's sort of theoretically ambiguous. It could have substitutive effects. So you essentially, by increasing your resources, you have more income, right? You can consume more. So note, increasing your resources, if it's cash, so not necessarily food stamps or Medicaid, increases your access to credit, right? Because creditors look at what your income is, and that increases your access to credit. But so the consumptive or the substitutive side, you have greater income, that helps you meet expenses better. You are less likely to use credit or have to borrow, particularly to meet immediate consumption needs, and therefore you're in less debt, right? And we might think of this as particularly around these subprime loans. On the flip side, there may be a consumptive effect. So you have greater income, you have greater access to credit, and you might decide, I'm going to invest now in higher quality housing. I'm going to eat better food. I'm going to buy a car. And so it has the potential to also lead to greater debt. So sort of a priori, it's theoretically ambiguous. So there is a little bit of evidence on so far on the substitutive versus consumptive effects. Thinking about conditional transfers, so social welfare programs, essentially the few studies suggest that more generous social insurance and means tested programs are associated with less unsecured credit use. So people borrow less in the unsecured credit market. At the same time, there are some consumptive effects, and this is particularly around childcare, the studies that have been done, and investments in children. As people get a little bit more money from policies, they tend to try to get higher quality childcare and invest more in enriching activities for their kids. So somewhat of a mixed story. There's a tiny bit on unconditional transfers, and it's really been, the two studies that are out there, it's really been mixed evidence. Okay. So now I'm going to I'm going to sort of walk you through 4 studies. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on data and methods. So I have sort of one overarching data and methods slide. So what some colleagues and I did, we bought a 1% sample from one of the big 3 credit bureaus of all credit reports, mainstream credit reports in the whole US. We then also bought the credit reports of all of those people's household members. So we have the individual, their household. There also happens to be a separate credit reporting for subprime loans. So we bought that for all of those people. So we can get the subprime loans for our sample in this period. Not everybody has one. If you don't borrow in the subprime market, you don't have it. So we've in 3 of the studies I'm going to talk about, we've linked this data. So we have individual characteristics from the credit reports, though limited. And then we've linked this to state and zip code level range of policy variables, demographic data, economic and context data. So I'm going to show you 3 studies that use a 2-way fixed in period effect. Sometimes it's year, sometimes it's quarter, to really get at when policies vary over time across states, how does this change at the individual level, growth or reductions in debt? The second thing we did was buy these credit reports for the entire population of Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, we have this amazing administrative data that tracks, earnings, income, kids' school records, corrections records, and all benefit programs. And so we've linked at the individual level to this data system. So we have really rich individual data stuff. That one, I'm going to focus on the 2021 child tax credit, and I'll use a difference in discontinuities approach. I'll make the comparisons clear when I do each study. So the first one we looked at was an unconditional cash transfer, and how does this play out in terms of high cost credit? So this is leveraging the Alaska Permanent Fund. So the big question is does getting a chunk of money once a year with no conditions for every individual in the state lead to less credit use? And does it vary by population group in the income distribution? So Alaskans since 1980, Alaskans get a dividend every October that is 25% of the revenue on the returns to the sale of natural resources. So this is largely oil. And you get a check. It averages $2,000 per year. 90% of the Alaska population receives it. And so what we're going to do, but it varies every year. So some years there's a big return, some years there's a small return. And so what we're going to do is look over the 2015 to 2020 period and say, as this varies among Alaska citizens, how does variation in Alaska in unsecured borrowing compare to variation in other states in unsecured borrowing? So here is the variation in the Alaska Permanent Fund. So it's from less than $500 to $3,500. So lots of variation over time. I'm going to look at, in the first 3 papers, I'm going to show you the same three outcomes. So one is your probability of opening a new credit card. The second is your probability of taking a new personal finance loan. So these are loans from fintechs. These are loans from online borrowing. They're not as high cost as payday loans, auto title loans, but they're relatively high cost compared to bank loans and things like that. And the third is alternative financial system loans. So these are the payday loans, the really high cost loans. So what you see for the whole population of Alaska versus other states, not much action on new credit cards, not much action on new personal finance loans, a really large decline in the predicted probability of a new alternative financial system loan. So from about a 3.2% probability to about a 1.5. So a 50% drop in the probability of taking these loans. If we split it out by income or tercile, so the top bar is the lowest, the bottom bar is the highest, the red's the lowest. What we see is this is largely driven by the lowest income tercile. It's particularly large and steep on the new alternative financial system loans. But we also see a pretty substantial decline of about 20% in new personal finance loans for that group. We also see some increase in new personal finance loans for sort of that middle tercile, right? And this might be, we're going to do something new to our house when we have more money. We're going to borrow some money for these kinds of things. The second study I want to highlight. So this is what we wanted to look at was the total value, the total package of the means tested safety net across states, and how this tracks with changes in debt over time. And so what we're basically going to say is the generosity of the expected safety net value in your state, and I'll tell you which programs in a minute, in a state and quarter, when it's higher or lower, how does that associate with debt? So what we basically said was we're going to take 6 programs: SNAP, Medicaid, SSI, TANF, child care subsidies, and tax rates for low-income families. We're going to say, what is the average benefit that low-income families get from each of these, and what's the inclusion rate? So what % of the eligible are included in that program? We're going to multiply them by each other to discount the average benefit by your probability of getting it. Sum it all up, and that's your sort of average expected benefit in your state. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the difference in the change over time in unsecured credit use between individuals in higher and lower total social safety net regimes. We're going to look at quarters from 2015 to 2020. So the first thing I want you to see is, so this is the over time, each state's average package. And so lots of variations in the total average from, over $15,000 a year to $6,000 a year in the total package across states. If we look, there's also variation within states over time. If we look within each of these programs, lots of variation in levels across states and lots of variation over time, even in just this 5-year period in the average expected benefit. So what are our results? So I'm going to show you the same 3 outcomes. This time it's in income quartiles instead of terciles. The black line is the lowest income quartile. What we see is very large reductions in new AFS loans and new personal finance loans for the lowest income. We also see smaller reductions for that second income quintile. So for new AFS loans, so we're at about, 2.7% in the lowest benefit state, so $6,000 a year. It's down to 1%, so 2/3 lower in the most generous state where they're giving $14,000 a year. We also see with regard to new credit cards, so we see the reduction is really in the middle 2 income groups. So this is more of working poor, low-wage workers, that kind of thing. We see a huge increase of new credit card applications among the lowest income group. And so this could be positive, this could be negative. You have more access to credit. If you're able to pay it off, it could be a positive. But if you're not able to pay it off, it should be a negative. But in any case, it seems to be at least a shifting between very high cost debt and credit cards and opening credit cards. The third one I want to highlight, so the next two are both going to be policy expansions during the COVID pandemic. So the first one, so high unemployment during the COVID pandemic, we did huge expansions in the length of time you could get, the size of the benefit. Lots of it was federal. It also varied by state, particularly in when states started clawing back the benefits. And I'll show you some data on that in a second. So, but we're essentially going to look at the maximum expected benefit from UI in your state quarter and how that plays out on these same debt measures over the, the roughly 20 quarters spanning the pandemic. And similar to how we did the whole safety net, what we're going to do is take the maximum UI payment, multiply it by, in this case, the possible number of weeks that you can receive it, and that'll be your maximum expected benefit. Okay, so the first thing to say, so this is state unemployment generosity. The red line is when we're in the pandemic and we start getting the federal assistance and state assistance. So very different levels, but not a ton of change across quarters in the pre-pandemic period. In the post-pandemic, everybody bumps up a lot, but they bump up to different rates. And what you see is they start dropping at very different rates. And so that is largely the variation that we're harnessing, is this as they start to shorten. Same three pictures again. So what we see is a decline in credit card debt for the lowest and the second income quartiles, biggest for the lowest. If we look at new personal finance loans, we see a relatively big drop by about almost 40% for the lowest income quartile. The other three, we see an increase. When we look at new AFS loans, again, we see a large drop for the lowest, some increase for the higher group. So I have a theory on this. And so my theory is why we're seeing some of this opposite direction for the higher income groups. So for one, unemployment insurance is going to replace less of your income if you're higher income. So lots of very low income people got more in uninsurance benefits than they were making and can afford not to borrow. Higher income people have higher housing payments, they have higher car payments. And so my theory is that it may not, so it's enough to keep their access to credit, but may not be enough to pay all their bills. I do not, that's a theory. I have no empirical evidence of that. But it was a sort of striking odd finding when we first did it. Okay, and the last study I want to highlight is looking at the monthly child tax credit. So very nice tie to Jane's book. So during COVID, so in 2021, the Biden administration did, as part of the American Rescue Plan, a child tax credit expansion. I'm going to look at newborns. So for kids under 6, it was $300 a month. It was fully refundable. Didn't matter what your work or earnings were. Half of the benefit was paid in monthly installments from July to December. The rest was paid in lump sum at tax time. What we're going to leverage is in Wisconsin, kids who were born in December 2020 were eligible for the, or were not, kids who were born in December 2020 were eligible for the benefit. Kids who were born in January of 2021 were not. Presumably, these two groups of kids are pretty similar, except for being born a month apart. So we're basically looking at all lower income births in Wisconsin, and we're going to see the difference over time in growth, in this case, growth, because everybody's debt growth in debt. So this is total amount, this is just descriptively, total amount of unsecured debt their mothers held in, the change from pre to post CTC. What you see is among the ineligible, debt grew by about $775 for mothers over the next year. For the eligible, it grew, but it grew by $575. So slower rate of growth in total unsecured debt, among mothers of kids who were eligible for, not received, the child tax credit. We did this across a whole bunch of different debt indicators. So on average, they had $265 less. So this is fully controlled models, less unsecured debt, $111 less credit card debt, 14% less intensive credit card use, which means spending 80% of your available limit, 63% less likely to take a personal finance loan, 90% less likely to take a subprime loan, a auto loan, a payday loan, and $165 of less debt in collections. Okay, so my key takeaways. So more generous social policy transfers are certainly consistently across these papers implicated in potential for less high cost debt for low income populations. That's across all 4 of the studies. We see it in terms of personal finance loans and alternative financial services loans. Much more mixed evidence around the credit cards, with some of the policies being associated with more credit card openings and some of them with less, and some differences across the income distribution. Some evidence in the UI during pandemic of more loan taking for the middle and higher income populations, though not the low income population. And CTC seems to have reduced unsecured debt across every category that we've looked at. So where do we weigh in on substitutive or consumptive? So clearly substitutive in terms of alternative financial system loans and personal finance loans for low income populations. Consumptive potentially for some credit card openings for some of the lower income populations, and some loan taking potentially higher up in the income distribution. So what are some of the implications for policy practice and future research? So I would argue that policies matter for both access to credit and for debt taking. I focus today on social welfare transfers, lots of implications for thinking about the full costs and benefits of these programs, including what they mean for people's debt, right? I didn't focus on these today, but other debt regulation policies matter a lot. So there's sort of balancing access policies, so truth in lending laws, information. There are laws around usury fees and interest rates, small dollar loan laws, bans of, for some states, ban auto title loans, for instance, price regulation, and access regulation. So we really want to expand access in ways that still protect consumers. So these are sort of the anti-discrimination in lending policies. And then the last thing to sort of think about is credit report utilization and what that means for populations when landlords and employers rely on this. I also think it may be important and overlooked in practice. So we often might talk to clients about material hardships or about income or what's coming in, or about even some of your expenses and what's coming out. But rarely, and I think anecdotally, but from talking to practitioners in Wisconsin, do people talk about buy now, pay later loans? Or do you have all these different types of high cost credit that are pretty common? And these debts, I said earlier, people in our survey reported very high levels of stress around them. Maybe really important and salient for them in thinking about engagement with services, in thinking about moving their situations forward. And again, it may have consequences for their housing and their employment and their well-being. And lastly, I think the research in this area on the well-being side and the social policy side is quite limited so far, given huge data limitations that I mentioned before, and really a lack of very many quasi-experimental studies to try to get at causal relations. I am going to stop there and let you read the acknowledgments. I have great collaborators, lots of funders to thank, and others. Thank you so much, and I'm ready for questions.
I guess we can come sit here for questions. Oh, we have 8 minutes. And so many questions. I mean, this is so topical. I mean, I think the headlines today were about student loans
Yeah.
and how you had that graph where they plummeted and now they've
And
gone
now they're
back
coming
up
back up.
again.
Yeah.
So just a small question. It's not my question. It came in on the internet in
Okay.
advance. So what are the prospects for change and in this political moment? And
So-
remember that you're being,
Yes.
brought
So I
back.
think in this political moment, it's very hard to know. So I think in this political moment, I don't think we have a good understanding of or I don't have a good understanding of what's going to be priorities or not in this arena. I think there is, or there has been in recent years, worries about these high cost debts, and
yeah.
states have cranked back on interest rates and fees. Some states have instituted bans. There have been changes in some bankruptcy policies across states. My guess is it's going to happen at the state level.
Yeah.
And but I think that people are aware. There was, after the Great Recession, there was a big focus on subprime lending, predatory lending, and we did claw back some of the access to credit. But again, it's a tough tension to figure out where the right dividing line is.
I mean, my other reaction is that this is just such a great area for research because, what you presented was like a massive research agenda, and yet there's so much more that one
There's
could
so much
do.
more,
So it's just a great area for research.
Yeah.
But were you raising your hand, Melissa?
Yeah.
I was. Thank you for a terrific talk with a lot of complicated information that you made accessible and understandable for someone like me. So thank you. I'm really struck by a lot of things, but one thing that really strikes me is the differences that you showed in terms of the debt to income ratio across states. And as you said, in ways that I would never have guessed. And then pointing to cost of living is very different across those states. And then you also alluded to the fact that the policies are so different across those states. So I'm trying to think through that. It sounds like a lot of natural experiments that
So
we
I-
can do, but how do you control, there's got to be so much potential for confounding in that.
Yeah.
And how do you
So I
do it?
think part of the potential so you're absolutely right, there's potential for confounding. So part of, if you have really good longitudinal data, you may not rule everything out, but it's things that have to change at the same time across the different states. And that's why we're really focusing on difference in changes over time within and across the states. And I think that there is, data hasn't been available until recently. The Fed has been tracking debt for a long, long time. But I think there's great opportunities for natural experiments around the debt regulations, around, potentially some economic and policy factors. So I think that we're at a really good point to launch those studies. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this excellent presentation, really informative. I have a question, I think, about human behavior. I know you're a policy person, but also a policy related question. And the question goes something like this. I'm intrigued by the credit card data. I remember many years ago, credit cards started calculating for you. If you don't pay this off, you will end up paying
Yeah.
$100,000 over the time of whatever. And to what extent can that explain some of this? And then the human behavior question is, especially, I don't know if this is true, you tell me. For low income populations, is there such a thing as targeting that I'm going to send you in the mail, credit card, applications, and you have a great chance. So what is the role of it's so easy
Yeah.
to apply for these.
And I do think like supply matters too. And so I think they're targeting that way. They're targeting online. I'm going to do that one first and then I'll come back to the other. So the other thing that's really interesting, Meg B has some work looking at policy variations across states and where payday lenders set up. And it turns out like when benefits are higher, many more payday lenders come in. However, their business grows much more slow. The total business, not per store, grows much more slowly over time. So it's a mix. They know people are still poor and have a little bit more money, so they come in and they get some business, but they don't get as much business as in the lower over time in the lower benefit states where people are more desperate to borrow. And I find it to be a pretty convincing paper. So I don't know how well these sort of truth in lending laws work. I don't know how well people look at these things. In 3 of these 4 studies, we weren't really looking at amounts. We were looking at opening accounts. And in some sense, opening a credit card is a good thing. You build credit, right? But you have to be able to pay it back. And if you're not paying back, you're better off not paying back a credit card than an alternative financial services loan or a personal loan. So it does seem to me that you're shifting to slightly better credit, at least among the low-income people. I mean, in future work, we want to look more, which we did in the child tax credit, around delinquencies, around debt balances, and those kinds of things. People were clear in our survey, and when we talked to them, that these alternative financial services loans are not things we want to do, right? And so even if your credit card tells you you're going to owe this much, if I'm going to owe double or triple that through this other mechanism, it still makes more sense to borrow through a credit card.
Thank you so much for a brilliant talk. My question is whether the findings vary by different population groups. They seem to align very well across studies, but the final study is among new mothers and the others are among households. So I also wonder if these findings may vary by household structure or cultural background, things like that. Thank you.
Okay. So we can't do that in the national data because the credit reports don't have it. They don't have race. They don't have marital status, things like that. They have income. We've done a little bit of work with zip code race, and so there is a little bit of variation. In Wisconsin, we're going to get to that, and we are going to start looking for different demographic groups. Yeah.
All right, we're going to hand back to Melissa.
Thank you again. This was such a great session. Thank you both Jane and Lonnie for putting this together. And thank you for your work looking at economic opportunity, which can be facilitated or hindered so dramatically by policy, and bringing a real social work lens to that, because that's really what's going to matter to the well-being of families and children. So great talk again. Thank you.